Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. And as always, it's good to see you, Clyde. I'm going to get started right away because it's quite a bit of information I want to present. But one of the things I want to make clear in the beginning is this: the title or the subject is how Black people in Chicago got some reparations. In order to, and I'm going to prove that it actually was a law made that said reparations, okay, here in Chicago. But in order to get to that, I have to give some preliminary information of of what led to that finally, because this was a process that took over 25 years in order to get an actual law that said this is reparations. Okay, so let me start out by saying, first of all, the reparations came because of police abuse and brutality. But it wasn't just one case that led to it. It was actually Chicago went through a period actually of about 40 years where Chicago police teams or crews, as they called them, systematically framed and tortured Black men. Uh, and we're talking about several different teams. And that's what's so deep because it caused a lot of damage, not only to the communities, to the Black communities of Chicago, but it also caused a lot of, what do I want to say, a lot of damage to Black relationships between Black men and Black women in Chicago. And you'll understand better as I get into this, but I want you to understand that this was almost totally against Black men. And while this was happening, and we're talking about over a 30 to 40-year period, when Black men who were being subjected to this abuse, to this framing, to this torture, all kinds of things, and they were speaking out about it, for the most part, now not totally, but for the most part, uh, people in general dismissed them. They said, everybody claims they're not guilty, that kind of thing. In particular, a lot of Black women dismissed what Black men were saying and trying to tell them. And that caused a lot, in a lot of situations, caused big rifts between Black men and women. At the same time, there was a calculated effort to recruit Black women as Chicago police. In fact, Chicago Police Department today has a higher percentage of Black women as officers than any other metropolitan area in the country. Even though it's still a minority, a minority number, but it's still high. And when you look sometimes at events and stuff like that where the police are, you'd be surprised at how many Black women are in that group. It's a lot of white women too. They got a lot of women in the police department. And as you will see how that plays out against Black men, it's deep. And that's why what occurred was that finally there was some resolve that came down in the form of reparations. The first one I want you to check out is this.
A former Chicago police sergeant accused of leading a rip-off crew in the 90s that shook down drug dealers for cash, drugs, and guns is set to go on trial today. Eddie Hicks was initially due in court all the way back in 2003, but Hicks skipped town instead, leaving his co-defendants to face charges. 14 years later, the 68-year-old was arrested in Detroit and is back in Chicago in federal custody. A former Chicago police sergeant accused of leading a rip-off crew in the 90s that shook down drug dealers for cash, drugs.
Okay, that is Hicks, Eddie Hicks, and as the little news blurb said, he was brought back to Chicago after being on the run for 14 years. But I want you to understand something here. Yeah, I see you put that link in there, Clyde, and that's cool. But it's a bigger picture than that, though. All right. Eddie Hicks was a former Chicago police sergeant. He was accused of leading a crew, in other words, other police that he was in charge of, that shook down drug dealers for cash, drugs, and weapons. This was in the 1990s. And he had been on the police department for 30 years and had retired in 2000. He even had trained at the FBI Academy in Quantico. But now he was originally supposed to go on trial in 2003 because this blew up after he retired. But he skipped town. He was arrested in Detroit in 2017 and brought back to Chicago. And finally, this year, in fact, a few weeks ago, he was finally put on trial, and he was convicted. He has been charged with extortion, bribery, racketeering, drug conspiracy, theft of government funds, possession of a firearm, and furtherance of a drug conspiracy. He was assigned to the narcotics section between 92 and 97. And he and his team, this is the kind of stuff they would do. They used counterfeit police badges, stole unmarked cars from the motor pool, sometimes using license plates from out-of-service police vehicles. They posed sometimes as DEA task force officers when they would pull people over. And they forged search warrants to raid houses and apartments and hotel rooms. And then they would divvy up the money and the proceeds at the police station on 51st and Wentworth, which they called the gym. They ripped off marijuana that had been stolen earlier from a man who paid $100,000 for its return. And I mean, they just, they were on the wild, as we would say. Okay? Now, when he went on the run, he was on the run from 2003 and until 2011, his monthly police pension checks were still going out, over $300,000. It was either paid directly to his bank account or cashed by his wife. All right? Now, in his case, one of his team, or two of his team, were convicted. They were convicted of crimes based around that. But the majority of his team, they never were charged. They never got convicted of anything. All right, now here's what I want you to understand. The people that they framed and the people that they robbed and the people that they abused, that affected the whole community in that area. Because whenever you have the police as teams doing stuff like that, framing people and all of that, it hurts not just the immediate families, but the extended families, and people in the neighborhood. All right, you think that's bad? Check this one out.
Framed by a corrupt Chicago police sergeant, 10 men who spent years in prison had their names cleared today. Happy faces as these men walked out of court this morning. Today's mass exoneration marks the fourth in the last 15 months. The Exoneration Project says for more than a decade, former CPD Sergeant Ronald Watts and his team planted evidence and fabricated charges, even organizing their own drug and gun trade that led the Cook County State's Attorney's Office to vacate and dismiss the charges of dozens of men and women.
To this day, I am not physically capable, able to go to sleep right. I can't eat the same anymore. The way I think is messed up. I can't get a job. I'm physically capable of what this man did to me. He destroyed any capability of me becoming something.
Watts was federally indicted in 2012 and pleaded guilty to taking a bribe from an informant. He served 22 months and was released in 2015. Framed by a corrupt Chicago.
Now, this person, his name is Watts, Ronald Watts. Now, in his case, he and his crew they ran for over 10 years. They also were framing people and planting drugs on people, and they did it so much that over the last year, it has led to, let me see how many, that news piece had 10, but actually over the time period of the last 6 months, really, the number is up to 59. And there's still another 38 cases that they're looking at. Now, here's what you got to understand. Again, Watts and his crew, they basically ran a area of one of the projects, as we call them, one of the public housing sections. And they were just on the wild. They framed people and put people, framed them into prison. Sometimes they did it to one brother twice. And the people were steadily saying, hey, these guys are corrupt. And yet, now this is one of his crew, Khaled Muhammad. And Khaled Muhammad is one of the few that actually went to jail. The rest didn't. Now, here's what was happening. Over that 10-year period, while they were doing this, and as I said, people kept complaining about it and everything. There were different probes and all of that. And nobody could seem to touch Watts and them. He finally was convicted in 2013 in a sting with the feds. But even then, he only got what did he get? He only got a couple of years, and he was in and out, and he's out now and retired. His other team members, because Khaled Muhammad and him were charged with theft of government funds. And just show you how police are. When those two got busted, the superintendent of police had the audacity to say publicly, well, these are the only two that were involved. They knew good and well as a whole team of them. The rest of the team have been on desk duty since 2015. What is this, 2019? They've been on desk duty for 4 years. The rest of his team, they have not been charged. They're still getting paid. And haven't, like I say, haven't gone to jail. Um, Again, I want you to understand, in this case, there's at least 59 cases that were overturned or people were exonerated. Most of them had gone to prison and gotten out, had done the time, and they were still trying to clear their names. And so for the state's attorney's office to publicly uh, overturn their cases or retract their cases and say, look, we exonerate these people because they were not guilty of these crimes. In Watson's case, at least 59 so far and another 38 to come. That's almost 100 people. How many families were affected by what they were doing? How many fathers were taken away from their families and prevented from taking care of their families? And uncles, and brothers and sons. What hurts me so bad is that, yeah, these were black men. All right, but now still didn't get no uh, reparations there. But now we move to the situation that brought about the first instance that we know of in the United States where a city formally awarded reparations to some black people. And that's because of this.
Over the past 8 years in the city of Chicago, there has been a systematic violation of the human rights of African Americans who have been subjected to some of the most indignant conduct that any human being can visit upon another. We have assembled because we are making a statement that when one individual, be he black or white, makes a determination to abuse the rights of another, that there are men and women of conscience in this town who will come forward and stand up and say, we will not tolerate that type of barbarity. We have got to hold John Burns. We say no.
Now, as Clyde has put a link up there to where I posted some years ago, actually, about this case, John Burge was a police detective and a commander in the Chicago Police Department for over 20 years. John Burge and his crew systematically tortured and framed black men, and they did it to such an extent that it eventually led to a governor, Illinois governor, closing down death row and commuting the sentences of several convicted black men. And it is my conviction, my belief that because that governor did that when he was finished his term, he was then indicted and convicted of crimes that he really didn't have nothing to do with, and imprisoned for the entire term of his sentence. He didn't even get parole, none of that. And I believe that was because he closed down death row and he commuted the sentences of black men, and he said publicly that the process was so tainted that he needed to shut it down. And this was about John Burge's people's convictions. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about John Burge. He was a Army veteran. He had served in South Korea and in Vietnam. When he returned to the south side of Chicago, he became a city police officer and ending it as a commander. Now, what originally started this whole thing about these confessions and the torture was this. In 1982, several police officers were shot and killed, and the perpetrators were allegedly two biological brothers. They were the Wilson brothers. It was a huge manhunt to find these police killers, and they caught them, and they were tried and convicted. Now that was 1982. One of the brothers, one of the Wilson brothers, filed a civil suit in 1989 against Burge and his team and the city for police torture and cover-up. Now, Burge was acquitted in 1989 because of a hung jury. He was suspended from the Chicago Police Department in 1991 and fired in 1993. You would think that was the end of it. No, because what you have to understand is this. He claimed that he was tortured. But because he was a cop killer, convicted cop killer, people said, so what if he was tortured? He deserved it. And you know, if he did, okay? But of course, Burge and the people denied it. However, there's a law office called the People's Law Office. They took up his case. And they proved over the years that he had been tortured. And it came out about how there was this systematic torturing of people, and that Burge and them had been torturing people for a while. And there were people all over the prison system doing all kind of time. Some doing life sentences. Some were on death row that had been tortured by Burge and them. So they began protesting. They were protesting, and the People's Law Office and some others, the Exoneration Group and some other groups, started trying to get attention about this because it was outrageous. For one thing, and I didn't tell you this about Burge, I did tell you he served in Korea and Vietnam. One of the things he did in Vietnam, he was a military policeman. And he supposedly did interrogations of Vietnamese. And in those interrogations, they used to use what they called a torture box. It was basically a thing where they had electrical things they put on their testicles and would shock them. Okay, and it's well known that that was something that went on in Vietnam. Well, Burge did that over there, allegedly. And so when the prisoners here would be talking about the kind of things that happened to them, it was reminiscent of the things that he was doing in Vietnam. But let me let you hear a couple of things. Because you have to understand, all while this is happening, in the communities, you had some folks saying, that stuff ain't true. And especially among some black women, they were saying, they would never do that. They don't torture people. And black men were saying, yes, they are. Yes, they do. And I feel bad for especially quite a few of the brothers tell you They lost their family and everything while they were locked up. And part of it had to do with how nobody believed them. Their wives, their mothers, no. You know, all right. But there were some people who were fighting for it.
To stop the torture.
The purpose of the task force has been to take to the public the issue of police brutality, specifically the case of police torture involving John Burge and his many victims. We also felt that if this was condoned, then certainly the garden variety everyday street beat-ups would certainly be condoned as well. And I think the activities we've done have been to educate people about the existence of torture by police in Chicago, and then to try to build a militant position around that, a position of confrontation with City Council, with the mayor, at City Hall, and a position that required them to deal with it.
To stop the torture.
On Saturday, April 27th, there will be another mass anti-racist march in Bridgeport to protest police lawlessness and racist violence there, and to protest the mayor's refusal to take action against Police Commander John Burge and his Chicago Police Torture Squad.
The reason we've come here today is because we've gone to the police board, we've gone to city council, we've gone to police headquarters, we've gone to Office of Professional Standards, and nobody's done anything. So now here we are, and we had to come to Daley's house. We had to come to his neighborhood because there's been a lot of racist violence in here, and nobody's done anything. Daley, the mayor, who's done nothing about it. At some point, it's going to be a political liability, and Burge is going to have to go.
Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Racist cops have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Racist cops have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Racist cops have got to go! Esta lucha va a llegar! ¡A la guerra popular! ¡Esta lucha va a llegar! ¡A la guerra popular! Racist, sexist, anti-gay, Danny and Burge, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay, Danny and Burge, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay, Danny and Burge, go away!
He handcuffed me real tight. As I said, he cut my circulation off. He went out of the room and stayed, I guess, for about an hour. And then came back and tried to talk to me, asked me what could I tell him, about the robbery. I told him I couldn't tell you anything about the robbery. I don't know nothing about what you're talking about. And he said then that, oh, you're going to play tough. So you will tell us before you leave here what we want to know. So I've been known to get out of people's what I want. He got real upset and said, you will talk, you black motherfucker. You said, I'll make you talk and kill you in here one. So I still don't understand. So he, in anger, he rushed to the typewriter and grabbed the plastic cover off there and just crammed it down over my head. And it's like he was a madman. This other officer helped me because I was trying to get my arms out from behind the chair, but I couldn't do anything. And I passed out. And like I said, he gave me a breath of air, and I came to conscious, and you ready to talk? And I said, I don't have anything to tell you still. So he do it again. The third time, out of the third time, that's when I told him, I said, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, man. Just don't do this no more. But he went out and got a piece of paper and came back.
I wasn't a human being to them. I was just simply another subject of theirs. They had did this to many others, but to them it was fun and games. I was just, quote, a nigger to them. That's it. They kept using that word like that was my name. So no ma'am. They had no respect for me being a human being. I never expected, quote, police officers to do anything that barbaric. That was my first time. You don't continue to quote, unquote, call me niggers throughout the day unless you are a racist. And the way that they said it so downright nasty. So there's no doubt in my mind that in my case, racism played a huge role and what happened to me, because they enjoyed this. You know, this wasn't something that was sickening to them. None of them had looks on their faces like, you know, maybe we shouldn't do this much. Nuh-uh. They enjoyed, they laughed, they smiled, you know, and that is why my anger has been so high, because I continuously see how they smile. I continuously see how all three enjoyed this here. You know, if I had been white, I doubt very seriously if I'd have been treated that badly. You know, but because of the fact that I'm Afro-American, you know, who's going to believe me, you know, in court? Nobody.
As far as having a plastic bag placed on my head, being beaten, being disrespected, being called niggas, being threatened with death. We were young kids being forced to deal with a system. Many of us went to the state's attorney in the process of being forced to sign confessions. Before we got to writing and signing our names on that bogus confessions, we confronted the state's attorneys with the allegation of torture. They saw scars. They saw tears. They saw the beaten chest of Gregory Banks. They saw the injuries on Daryl Cannon. They saw the injuries on Satan Holmes. But they turned a deaf ear. And today, I'm encouraging you guys to go further and look into the state's attorneys who participated in these cases. See what they have grown and developed. See now as they sit on the judges' benches right now, and they run prosecutor's office, and they run the county investigation. As far as having a plastic.
I was laying flat on the floor. He lifted me off the floor. I was on my back, and he lifted me up and pulled the bag off my head, because I know when I woke up, opened my eyes, the bag was off my head. And I felt like I said the last time, I said, this is it. Because, you know, it felt like 1,000 needles going through my body. Each time it shocked me. And then I got the burning sensation, and it was just too much. And so when he lifted me off the floor the last time, I said, this is it. Man, whatever you want me to say, do it, I did it. Whatever it is, kill the president, yeah, I did that too. I didn't kill. I just wanted out of there. I was laying flat on the floor.
Former Commander Burge, while working in Area 2 as a detective, later a sergeant and then a lieutenant, participated in and witnessed the abuse of people in police custody. Make no mistake about it, the people in police custody that were abused and tortured were suspected of awful crimes. Make no mistake, some of them may have been guilty of awful crimes, but that is no excuse. Torture and abuse have no place in a Chicago police station. The statute of limitations on that torture and abuse has long since passed. But former Police Commander Burge also filed lies, submitted lies, some under oath, in a federal civil rights lawsuit in 2003. And for his lies about this torture and abuse, we intend to hold him accountable.
John Burge is doing time. Police torture is a crime. John Burge is doing time. I say Burge, you say guilty. Burge, guilty. Burge, guilty.
We're very gratified that after a long delay, a measure of justice was achieved today with a verdict that was returned against John Burge. The jury spoke loudly and clearly with their guilty verdicts on 3 counts, and the jury found Mr. Burge guilty of perjury and obstruction of justice. But what's clear is that the jury necessarily found that torture occurred in Chicago police stations in Area 2 in the 1980s. And it's a disgrace that in this city, in the 1980s, people could be subjected to abuse and torture, ranging from guns to the face, guns in mouths, suffocating, electric shocks, radiator burns, that sort of thing.
We are elated that finally, 25 years after this evidence first came to light, there is some modicum of justice. There is some modicum of justice in this case. But as all of us know, this is only one phase in a long struggle that shall continue. And that struggle shall include the continued investigation of those men who this trial showed tortured under John Burge's command. Those men have to be indicted and tried for their perjury and obstruction the same way that Burge was.
think it's important for the community to organize, to educate, to agitate, to do things like get John Burgess off the force. But I don't think that that's the end all. I don't think that that's the answer. I don't think that's a panacea. I don't think because we don't have John Burgess on the police force, we have liberation.
Former Commander Burgess.
Woo. Now, as I said earlier, that I wanted to talk about how Chicago, Black Chicago, got some reparations. And I wanted you to understand that this wasn't a short battle, as you heard them talk about. 25 years just to get Burge convicted of perjury, not even of the torture, because among other things, there was a special prosecutor was named. Yeah, we have them in the state level too. There was a special prosecutor named. They spent 4 years investigating this torture issue, right? 4 years and $7 million. And this is what came out of it. The special prosecutors, they did not bring criminal charges against members of the Chicago Police Department despite the apparent existence of numerous provable offenses within the statute of limitations. They ignored the failure of former Cook County State's Attorney Richard M. Daley, State's Attorney Richard Devine, and various other high-ranking officials to investigate and prosecute police officers who engaged in a documented pattern of torture and wrongful prosecution of torture victims. And they did not document the systemic and racist nature of the torture, and did not brand it as such in accordance with the international definition of torture. Now, I put that in here because it's important to understand this was a protracted struggle. Went all the way to the UN, had special prosecutors and everything. And steadily you had black men that were being incarcerated and being kept in incarceration, and some were getting out, and slowly but surely, y'all, do you understand how deep this was? And this fact, the hurting part was that so many were ignored in terms of being told that it wasn't happening, that it didn't happen. They had special prosecutor and everything, and they didn't find nothing. Here's a short list. This is a list of some of the settlements that came out. All right. It starts back in 1988. Daryl Cannon, you saw him earlier. He got $3,000. Okay. In 1988, Philip Atkins got $25,000. Then Gregory Banks got $92,000. Wiggins got $93,000. David Bates, you saw him speak. He got $66,000. Now, Andrew Wilson was one of the brothers who was convicted of killing the police. He was the one who originally brought up the whole issue. And eventually, he ended up getting $1 million, but he was still locked up. Okay? Then Leroy Orange, he got $5.7 million. Aaron Patterson, he got $5.2 million. I remember Aaron Patterson's case very well because he fought to get he sued and he got this money, and he was out. But do you know Aaron Patterson, if I'm not mistaken, is still locked back up? He got locked back up because he took some of his money and he was trying to set up funds to help some of the brothers that hadn't gotten out yet, right? But he also got entangled with some kind of deal with some guns. And so the feds came and got him and put him in federal prison. Stanley Howard got 1.8 mil. Madison Hobley. Hobley was convicted of arson. Supposedly, um, his family home caught fire, and his children, if I'm not mistaken, uh, died in the fire. They convicted Madison Hobley of setting the fire, and it took years for him to get his proof, but he eventually got 7.7 million. And even then, when he first got out, they still fought to try and, because his case was overturned. In his case, the state's attorney was still trying to try his case again. And I know you heard where you saw where um, Mayor Richard Daley, now this was the son, this wasn't the old man Daley, this was the son. He was a state's attorney during the time that Burge and his crew were busy as heck. And so for years, the lawyers for the victims tried to force him into court, and then they tried to force him just to do a deposition on whether he knew that these people he was prosecuting had been tortured. He fought against that to this day. He has never been forced into a deposition to talk about what he knew. And he got elected mayor 3 or 4 times and stuff. Just show you how sick stuff is. But as you look through that list, you see some got millions, some didn't, some got nothing. But here's what you got to understand. Even though they might have been awarded like millions of dollars, they don't get it all in one lump sum. In 99% of the cases, when they get a settlement, they get a breakdown of so much per year. Okay? They don't give them all that money at once. In almost all the cases, at least that's the way it is in Illinois, whenever you see that a family got a settlement because somebody in their family got killed or whatever, they don't give them that money all at once. Now, the media, they make it seem like they do. But no, they get it in they actually call it stipends. Give them so much per year. Now, before I move on, I want you to look down this list and where it says down near the bottom, third from the bottom. You see it says 2015, reparations, 57 people, 5.5 million. That's the first time you see it officially, the word reparations. All right? And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want you to understand that here we got this is a graphic that deals with how much Burge and his people cost us, the taxpayers, because dig this. It's been documented that he oversaw the torture of at least 118 black men. Now, he was eventually convicted of perjury. He got 3.5, or he did 3.5 years. He was granted early release to where he was living in Florida. He still was getting his pension, $4,000 a month. He just died last year. But he was still getting his pension. So how much did this torture cost Chicago's taxpayers? More than $120 million. See, so far it's been $66.8 million in settlement to torture victims. Okay? Over 22 million in outgoing pension payouts to Burge's collaborators, meaning his team. Because none of them got convicted of anything. Over 20 million in legal defense to Burge and his boys, and over 15 million to investigate and prosecute Burge's crimes. Today, at least 20 torture victims are still behind bars. 65 claims of torture are currently being heard by the Illinois Torture Injury and Relief Commission. And I'll come back to this right here in a minute. Now, because of what occurred, because it was so egregious, for the first time in 2015, the city of Chicago did something that had never been done before. I'll let you see it. Reparations. This is actual city ordinance. Reparations for the Chicago police torture survivors. And this is historic. That's why I want you to see it. Whereas the city of Chicago acknowledges that former Chicago Police Commander John Burge and detectives under his command systematically engaged in acts of torture, physical abuse, and coercion of African American men and women in Area 2 and 3 police headquarters from 1972 through 1991. And whereas the acts of torture committed by Burge and detectives under his command included electrically shocking individuals on their genitals, lips, and ears with an electric shock box or cattle prod, suffocating individuals with plastic bags, subjecting individuals to mock execution with guns, physical beatings with telephone books and rubber hoses, and other forms of physical and psychological abuse. And whereas Burge and his men committed these acts of torture and abuse to extract confessions from the victims, which were subsequently admitted against them in their criminal prosecutions resulting in their wrongful convictions. And whereas these acts of torture, physical abuse, and coercion violate state, federal, and international law, and such acts are universally condemned worldwide. And whereas, and listen carefully, the trauma and damage caused by these heinous acts continue to deleteriously affect the torture survivors, their family members, African American communities, and the city of Chicago. And whereas the trauma and damage caused by these heinous acts will continue to cause egregious harm to those affected unless the city of Chicago and other municipal bodies enact reparations to mitigate the harm. And whereas the city of Chicago has been complicit in the torture practices and tacitly supported these acts by expending more than $20 million of taxpayer funds to defend Burge and other detectives implicated in civil litigation brought by the torture survivors. And whereas Mayor Emanuel has recently acknowledged that the torture scandal was a dark chapter in the history of the city of Chicago that stained its reputation and that he was sorry for it. And whereas the city of Chicago must officially acknowledge the torture that occurred in the city and resolve to never allow such acts to go undeterred and unpunished ever again, now therefore, be it ordained by the City Council of Chicago and the Mayor of Chicago, hereby issues a formal apology to the torture survivors, their family members, and other affected individuals and communities on behalf of the City of Chicago for the violations and harm incurred by these torture practices, hereby creates a Chicago Police Torture Reparations Commission that is responsible for administering financial reparations to the torture survivors to compensate them for the torture they endured. Hereby creates a center on the south side of Chicago that will provide psychological counseling, health care services, and vocational training to the torture survivors, their family members, and others affected by law enforcement torture and abuse. Hereby provides that all torture survivors and their family members be allowed to enroll in city colleges and receive their education and degree for free. Hereby calls on the Chicago public school system to incorporate into its curriculum a history lesson about the Chicago police torture cases and the struggles to hold those accountable and to seek reparations for the survivors and the affected family members. Hereby calls on local law enforcement officials to provide evidentiary hearings to the torture survivors who remain behind bars, who had their coerced confessions used against in their criminal proceedings resulting in their wrongful convictions, and moreover, supports the torture survivors' rights to have a full and fair opportunity to present evidence that demonstrates they were physically coerced into giving a confession. Hereby commits to supporting the creation of public memorials that memorialize the Chicago police torture survivors and the struggle for justice on their behalf. Hereby provides a minimum of $20 million to finance the Chicago Police Torture Reparations Commission, the Center on the South Side Center, the creation of a curriculum, and to fund the creation of public memorials set forth therein. Hereby directs the Corporation Council to take whatever legal steps are available to support the stripping of John Burge's pension, which, by the way, they never did manage to do. Now, I want to mention this part here because where it said $20 million for all of that, right? They also put up $5.5 million to pay two torture survivors who could prove that they were tortured and had not gotten any other money. But it was up to $100,000. Okay? And you know that's so cheap. They put in 5.5 million in the reparations fund, but they gave the whole thing $20 million. They should have done it the opposite way, in my opinion. This is the implementation. In May of 2015, they passed the reparations for Burge Torture Victims Ordinance. See, and this is why I'm putting this here so you can see. This is law. People in Chicago, black people primarily, and they had a lot of white folks support them in terms of the demonstrations and things, and that's important to understand too. But it took this kind of struggle to get this over 25 years. Okay? And by the way, free tuition, number 5, look at number 5. It says, free tuition at Chicago City Colleges for Burge torture survivors, their family members, including their grandchildren. See, when we talk about reparations, this is the kind of thing we're talking about, not just for a few people. We're talking about generationally, okay? Yeah. The passage of this legislation marks the first time in United States history that a city has passed legislation providing reparations, including financial compensation for police violence. And I have to tell you that one of the reasons why I followed this case for years, and I know quite a few of the lawyers that were involved, as well as I've met some of the survivors. But I wanted to do this in particular to provide some documentation for my friend and colleague Clyde Coger Jr. At the site where I present, called Desti.com. Clyde has been for years promoting the idea and understanding of the importance of reparations. And I know he's endured over and over again people saying, oh, you never get it, you never get it, you never get it. But I wanted him to be able to have something that he can present, or at least send people to link to this, to know that it has happened. See, once it has happened once, the first time, it means that the precedent has been set. Okay? The idea not only that they paid, that the city, and remember, this is the other part. We, the citizens, the taxpayers, are paying for this. You know, the one thing we haven't been able to do yet is force the union, the police union, to have to pay and make the police pay, because that would stop a lot of this stuff, right? Yeah, in a New York minute. But we have said for a long time that we want people to understand what happened here over 25, 30 years. And even as the ordinance said, that the city of Chicago, the officials, they fought us, the black community, black people, black men and women, who were not only tortured, but have supported the torture victims, and forced them to have to recognize what they tried their best to suppress. And I mean, and to this day, I still will run across a few people who try to say, oh, it wasn't that bad. No, it was that bad. It was that bad. Here's a list of the survivors, some of the survivors. And you look at all these names. That's one part of the list. It's another part of the list. And you look at all these names and think about it like this. These are people who had families. So just like the reparations dealt with the families of these survivors, they get psychological counseling. They get all kinds of things that hopefully will repair them some. Now, they can never get back the time they spent, and who knows what kind of things they endured in prison. You know, all the things that they missed from their children, things like that. But I am proud of the fact that it was fought for and it was achieved. And the majority of the men and women who were tortured have stood and been strong, and even afterwards, only a couple have done some stupid stuff, but the majority have fought to present themselves and become a part of the community that welcomed them home and fight for justice. So as I close, I'm going to let you hear Burge. I want you to hear him. I want you to see him. I want you to hear him, so that you understand how deep the struggle is. And again, woo! And thank you, Clyde. All right, and as always, I say, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.
Mr. Burge, would you state your full name and spell it for the record, please?
John, Jon, middle initial G as in George, Burge, B-U-R-G-E.
Okay. Now, during that 25 years, or 20 years of working with the Chicago Police Department, did you come across instances of police torture?
I will adopt my prior answer to the first question as my answer to that question.
Are you taking your Fifth Amendment rights?
That's correct, on advice of counsel.
And while in Vietnam, did you observe or participate in the use of electric shock against Vietnam POWs?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
And you take the Fifth Amendment.
That's correct.
And were you interrogating a suspect in Area 2 sometime in 1972 or 1973 when William Parker walked in and opened the door?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You take the Fifth Amendment on that?
Yes, I do.
And were you beating the suspect that you were interrogating at the time Bill Parker walked in and opened the door?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
Now, you taking the Fifth Amendment on that, sir?
Yes.
Did you use some kind of electrical device that generated electricity on Anthony Holmes to give him shocks when you were interrogating him?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You taking the Fifth on that?
Yes.
And did you also repeatedly participate in putting a plastic bag or a typewriter cover over his head when you were interrogating him in May of 1973?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You taking the Fifth?
Yes.
Early in 1982,